good afternoon, everybody. It's a little bit after 3 o'clock, and welcome to our online Hot Politics Lab. It's an important weekend. Sinterklaas is going to visit many of us. But before that, we have an exciting talk by Mariken van der Velden, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Communication Science at the neighboring VU University. So back in the days, we could wave to Mariken and she would see us on the other side of the city. Now we can only wave to her via the screen. But Mariken is presenting some work with Maurits Meijers, who is an assistant professor at Radboud University in political science. And I think, Mariken, if I am informed correctly, this is part of your VENI research, which has started this year. So that said, floor is yours, Mariken. It's great to have you, as always. And I will shut up now.
Thanks, Bert. Thanks a lot. I'm going to share my screen, so it takes a little bit to prepare. So yes, very happy to actually be here. I plan to give a talk on part of my VENI research already. I think when we're full in lockdown, so I'm very happy we could postpone it a little bit. And today I will present some work together with Maurits. This is both of our VENI researches on parties' reputational cost and on compromise. So we'll present our first study, give it a little, take a little. And okay, does this work? Yes. So what we'll tell you today is we'll present a series of pre-registered studies. Some have already been pre-registered and others are in the phase of being pre-registered on accepting compromise and how that has negative consequences for political parties' reputational costs. So we're now still on collecting one batch, the pre-registered batch. We have a OSF registered study. You can already visit that. We will also commit to the open data and open materials. And I'm also committed to my other research group, idea of having a structured compendium online. So all our materials will be found online in a little bit. So why do we research compromise? Compromise has been widely seen as a so-called boo-hooray concept. Because it has this tension in and of itself to be both liked and to be both disliked. Because on the one hand, we actually do know that striking compromises is a necessity in any form of democratic governance. You need to cooperate sometimes in order to get things done. At the same time, we also pretty strongly think that politicians taking distinguishable positions on issues that is key for them being held accountable. And on both sides of that tension, there are many works that actually show the importance of both sides. In addition to that, we actually have work that shows that people really value compromise as an abstract principle. So when you ask people how they feel about compromises in general, they say it's important for democracy. And we have evidence from both the US side as well as from broad European countries showing that people really value co-partisanship, multi-party governance, et cetera, but all as an abstract principle to the democracy. If we look at the practices, however, people don't really like it when parties compromise on things that they actually like to have done. So when it comes to practice, and there's also some research that shows that when parties actually compromise on a policy issue, it's much less valued than the support given to the abstract principle should suggest. And moreover, there's quite some work showing that as a party, if you either change your position or even change it so much that your kind of clear idea of who you are as a party becomes diffused or diluted, people really punish you for it, and you get so there is lower levels of party support. And the work of Noam Lupo actually shows that it's not only lower levels of support, but you talk about party breakdown. So people really lose trust in the party and of the positioning or in the promises the party make. So in our study, what we try to do is we try to contribute or base ourselves on these studies by really delving into what are now the costs of compromise for the reputation of a party, especially given that compromise is so necessary in multi-party governance, but in all governments, we'll see more and more that this is going to become a necessity. Moreover, as I already kind of hinted upon, there's a lot of focus on the US on bipartisanship, but there's just hardly any work, I should just say. I can name a handful of scholars that have looked at the cost of compromise in the European level. What we build upon their work is that we try to have a much more direct measure of compromise instead of the indirect measures typically used by the scholars at this point in time studying compromise. Moreover, we try to go beyond the observational studies. So we'll present here a series of 4 studies, of which one is an observational study for which we actually do have results. And we'll show with you, or we'll show you 3 experimental designs. Given that we're so committed to this open science thing, we actually really value your feedback on these designs because, we try to be as strict as possible, have a good idea, but then the feedback we prefer to have the feedback in this type of thing. And I think what I heard from the organizers or from Bert and Gijs is that this is typically difficult. And I do know that the online situation might not be ideal for that. But I also think, with our discipline moving more to open science commitments, the importance of getting feedback before pre-registering might become, or it becomes more important, at least we think. So we really hope to take you along with these designs as well. So our first study, as I said, is an observational cross-country study about the patterns, and we actually look on the effect of compromise on trust. And we actually affect that the more you're willing or the less you're willing to compromise, the lower your trust. And we do that by first looking at 4 countries, Germany, France, Austria, and Italy, and they're all from the comparative election study survey. And we supplement those 4 countries with the UK, so the British election studies, and the Netherlands, the Dutch parliamentary election studies. So we have 6 countries for now. And if you have seen the tweet by Maurits, we're still collecting more data or getting aware of more data to see if we can add a little bit more of the countries to this pattern. So what we're looking at is 2 particular variables. Our independent variable is the idea that compromise is selling out. If you agree, you're not very fond of compromises. If you disagree, so score of 5, you think compromises are at least sometimes necessary or okay. What this box plot shows you is that there is a lot of variation over countries, but the diamonds actually show that almost all the averages are a little over 3. So people on average think that compromises, let's say, is kind of part of the game, and that should be, that's at least for a normative stance, that's okay. We do see that there's quite some variations. So also a lot of people actually compromises selling out. So there's enough variation. And so is there on whether politicians are trustworthy, our independent variable. Here as well, we see there's a huge country variation. Here we will actually deal with this. There were quite some missing values in the British election study on this variable, but we use the Gerber and Green formula to impute it, and we will later show you that whether or not we imputed that data didn't really change our results. So when we want to predict political trust by the willingness to accept compromise, we had to control for a whole bunch of variables: political interest, ideological self-placement, government performance, party idea, a bunch of socio-demographics, country fixed effects because we pool it, and we had some missing variable dummies. The results that I will show you, or the one coefficient actually that we care about that I will show you, is robust against pooling, is robust and also holds for every single country, as well as is robust against the missing variable dummies, and as well we exclude the values that were missing. So what I'll show you is the effect. It's shown here. It looks like a little bit like I'm in the Sinterklaas mood by having this hat. but it's not. This is just the coefficient. There's a small positive effect, meaning if you're more willing to accept compromise, you have higher levels of political trust. So this kind of this goes, hand in hand with what we expected. So that's great. Compromise and trust correlate. So what? Great that this holds over many countries, but this is just the first step, so that, like, for us to develop our experiments. So what we actually like to know is, does striking a compromise lead to reputational costs? Because the former results could also mean that people that think that compromise is selling out are the same people as the people that actually think, I don't have trust in politics. The one doesn't need to cost each other, could just be there at the same time. So we want to know, does compromise lead to reputational cost? If so, or under which conditions, then which type of compromise do voters accept and which they don't? Because there's not one way to compromise, as I will show you in a little bit. And the last question that we would like to know is then, what are the mechanisms driving the acceptance of compromise? So for each of these questions, I will show experimental design, how we aim to disentangle these effects. So first we want to, so this part is not yet pre-registered. I'm going to say this already. And we are very much welcoming your feedback on any part of our presentation, but especially on the parts that we still need to pre-register. So first of all, we think using vignettes to look at the reputational cost of compromise, that being steadfast as a party leads to having more trust in the party compared to compromising as a party. However, sometimes parties need to compromise. Then we think that if a party compromises in the direction of your own position, that leads to more trust than when a party compromises in the opposite direction of your own position. Furthermore, the third hypothesis we aim to test is that if you strike a compromise, but you still become a government party, that leads to more party trust than if you were willing to compromise, and then all of a sudden, the government cannot be formed. So you wanted to kind of, take a step to the other side, but the coalition negotiations collapsed. People will have lower levels of trust than if there's actually a result as a compromise. So how do we aim to test these hypotheses? As I said, 2 vignettes. In the compromise vignette, the outcome is that the party A gives in to party B. In the steadfast vignette, party A sticks to their guns. So here we sketch the context for the respondents, which is coalition talks between party A and B. And party A, he has pledged to either increase or decrease the minimum wage. We need to have this increase and decrease in order to later test the second hypothesis. And party B will do the opposite of what party A pledges, otherwise compromise is not there. We also will tell the respondents that the issue that the parties have to compromise on is key for the negotiation. So not getting any compromise might lead to a breakdown. And then for both vignettes, the coalition formation can either fail or succeed. So we use this vignette and we actually look whether that treatment that a person is selected in leads to trust. And we measure trust with the question, would you trust a party like party A? We are planning to do this in the Netherlands as well as in the UK. In the UK, we could have taken real parties. In the Netherlands, it's already a 2x2x2 vignette study, thinking this about, like, saying the typical 11 parties in the Netherlands. This would blow my mind at least so much that I couldn't think about a proper way to test this. So we stick for the hypothetical parties A's and B's. If we notice, in a second set of surveys, we actually try to think about, okay, what type of compromise do people actually accept? Because we do know that, like, no form of government can go without any compromise. So, and we will show you a forced choice vignette experiment. So first of all, what are the types of compromise? A party could give in, so capitulation strategy, in order to, like, they want to be in government, for instance, so bad that they give in, their entire key issue to that other party in order to be in government. That is a form of capitulation. Meet in the middle strategy means that you both, give in a little bit and you meet each other, as it says, in the middle. Tit for tat is that you kind of do a log roll. If I give you A, you give me B, and I care more about A. So, I can perfectly give in on B. So these are the type of compromises we want to look on. There are also other possibilities, but we, for the sake of simplicity, we think three type of compromises are enough, as well as these are the most common compromises we would see. So the respondents would be confronted with a vignette like this, where one side always is the same, which is no compromise. So every respondent sees a no compromise treatment, and there it says like the parties are going to leave out these issues out of the coalition agreement. And then in the other side, where they have to choose between, they either see a capitulation strategy, where we tell them that on 2 issues, party A has given in on 100% of their proposals. So none of their proposals are accepted in the coalition agreement. In a meet in the middle strategy, we will say for both of the issues, 50% of the parties' proposals are accepted. And for the tit for tat strategy, we say 75% of the proposals on issue 1 are accepted, and 25% of the proposals on issue 2 are accepted. And we do this in this kind of complicated way of saying so many percentage of the proposals is in order to have the treatment at least of meet in the middle and tit for tat. It is kind of similar outcome utility. The expected utility of proposals are accepted, because one of the things we have been struggling with is that some of the treatments are just more appealing than others. Capitulation is definitely a less appealing treatment than the other 2. So this was something we really struggle with. And if you have any kind of suggestions how to even improve that, would be great. What we eventually will test is how the treatment affects the choice between either no compromise or a compromise type. So the type of, yes, and then like we're at the last part, which is how does which mechanisms actually drive the acceptance of compromise. For that, we rely on the work by Gutman and Thompson. We theorize that there are actually 2, let's say, underlying principles of accepting or not accepting compromise, which is on the one hand, principle tenacity, and on the other hand, it's mutual mistrust. So thinking about principle tenacity, I'll actually explain this. Principle tenacity is this idea that you're very, very principled. Nothing can kind of take you from your principles. And in order to measure that, we rely on 2 measures. One is adapted by the study of Tim Ryan, who looks at the willingness to accept benefits. And the idea is that if you're really principled, you don't want to take in money, because when you take in that money that you might receive, that same amount of money goes to an organization that sponsors something against your principles. So if you want to accept money, which most people actually like, then you have to do something that is going against your principles. When you're not willing to do that, then you're as principled as possible. Another way of actually looking at this is this absolutism scale, where you look at how consequentialist someone is or not is. We're still a little bit in doubt because this is a psychological scale, and at least for me as a trained political scientist, 20-item scales always sound enormous. That sounds like, I kind of hear like the cost coming. So we're still in doubt how to do this. I have this, I feel Bert looking at me that don't sell myself short, don't use too few items. We are clearly aware of that. So this is a struggle. But one of these items, I just copied one because 20 would be way too much, is, for instance, you think about someone being absolutist that agrees with this, doesn't agree with the statement, individuals should be allowed to formulate their own ethical codes. So people that really think, no, there's general ethical codes, everyone should stick to that. These peoples are principlists or have principle tenacity, as Gutman and Thompson talk about. The other side of underlying compromise is that you need to trust the other party to deliver on their promises. So when that trust is broken, this might drive the unwillingness to accept compromise. And we thought of measuring that with another psychological scale, namely thinking about how generally suspicious are you. 14 items, also on Likert. And one of these ways of thinking about it is answering a statement like, people rarely tell you what they're really thinking. If you really agree with that, you're more suspicious. And if you think, no, people actually do tell me what they think. So these are the types of questions or measurements that we try to elicit these mechanisms driving compromise with. And if we think about it, how does that relate to the different types of compromises? You should think that capitulation offsets both mutual mistrust as well as principled tenacity. Because if you capitulate, if you give in everything, you don't have to trust the other person at all, because the person doesn't have to give you anything. You just give in, and they can even, like, you know, kick you out of the coalition again. They can make fights with you. They cannot support your issues. So if anything, the capitulation strategy is most likely to offset the mutual mistrust mechanism, as well, of course, as a principled tenacity. If you're really principled, you don't like your party to give away everything, even if you get something in return for it, which is government. A meet in the middle should not offset the mutual distrust, because both parties need to move. So if both move, you actually could get some trust in the other side, thinking that, okay, if they're willing to move, they probably also deliver on their promises. Though if you're principled, you still don't like this. You don't want your party to move at all. The tit for tat strategy, from like how it now is written down, looks exactly similar to the meet in the middle. I'm going to tell you it's not. Because what we think is that the levels of principled tenacity might differ. For people that are full on absolutists, as Vin Arsenault would say, it doesn't really matter. They will not accept any compromise. But people with, let's say, moderate principles, they might accept taking in some issue that they like by giving up another issue that's not so important for them. So if they don't really care about it, they might be okay. But the most principled people, they will not like any compromise. But there's also not a big group. People that are that principled, that is a small group of, at least in the population, as I saw, is a small group. So we think that this is the most liked strategy and most likely offsets the least principled, offsets only the very principled people. This offsets, the majority of principled people. This offsets both of the mechanisms. That's basically the idea, how we think about that. And we want to test that with looking at the treatment and the choice and regressing that on how, mutual mistrusting someone is and how principled another person is. So I've showed you a lot of information. So I'll go a little bit, take a step back again. By telling you, in experiment 1, we aim to look at how, test the pattern we found in the experimental data, namely that willingness to compromise leads to or is negatively correlated with trust in politicians. In experiment 1, we actually tried to test that experimentally, having a little bit more of certainty. We had this idea about the treatment, which was this vignette study where we had people telling you about, okay, these parties will be in coalition agreement. The coalition agreement, this issue that they negotiate about, is key. Party A wants to increase something on an issue. Party B wants to decrease on that same issue. How does that affect, whether or not there is going to be a government, does that affect trust? We're a little bit worried that this is a little complicated for people, even though we have did quite some survey of the literature that this sounds possible, but please give us any feedback on this treatment. In the second treatment, we have the forced vignette. That's the same for the third experimental meeting in the experimental treatment. In that experiment, we actually look at what type of compromise people prefer. So there's always a no compromise condition, and there are 3 types of compromise conditions that will rotate or randomly assign to people, and people make a choice. And then the third one, we use the same experimental design in the same study as the second experiment, but we actually look what type of mechanisms are elicited by the types of compromise. Thank you very much. We hope to get a lot of feedback from you. If not, you can also reach us at any other means. And thank you, Bert and Gijs and Christian, for having us here.
You're welcome, Mariken, and thank you for this great presentation. You can now write your questions into the Q&A box, and I will read them to Mariken and Maurits, and hopefully one of them will answer. They might need to negotiate about this a little bit. You will capitulate. Okay. All right. I think. Oops. There's a question from Amanda Friesen. I'm curious how this work speaks to many of the conversations / literature on democratic norms. Well, that's a question for Maurits, I guess. Maybe.
Maurits, you have to unmute.
Yeah. Now it should work. Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for the question. So, I mean, I'm not sure exactly to what particular study you're referring to, but what we kind of our general frame here, our idea is that, okay, well, there are actually two central norms. On the one hand is that, well, in most democracies, we have to work together. We have to cooperate, especially in countries where you have to strike a coalition agreement, like the ones we do in our experiments. But also in countries where that's not the case, compromise is key. At the same time, there is this important norm of standing for something, having a clear programmatic profile, and these are obviously in conflict with one another. So I think that's kind of this is exactly the kind of the thorny issue we want to look at. Yeah.
Thanks. I had a question myself, and that's about the dependent variable in the study. Or maybe more broadly, the conceptualization of party and the costs. So I think, if I remember correctly, I had a little visitor walk in during your presentation, Mariken. So that was
Yes,
a little.
I saw.
That you talk about trust in politicians.
Yes.
In some of the subsequent experiments, you talk about fictitious parties, right? With the problem of the Netherlands. But in terms of costs that compromises have, I guess the only cost that is relevant is losing the voters you already have. And so why not enforce that principle a bit more in the research design? So one opportunity, for example, in the experiment could be is to simply ask people, which party they're going to vote for, and then impose that party into the experiment.
We thought of this, and what we didn't quite know. So we thought, like, a party like Party A would elicit a little bit more clearer response from people than asking them to vote for two fictitious parties. But I also do see that this is kind of, in the one hand, you see for an individual party, this would be a low cost. But if parties compromise all the time, so for democracy, this would mean a lot if people really lose trust in parties, because that means that they don't have, by some point in time, don't trust any party anymore. So I could see, both sides, and definitely I have written this already down when you were talking. We'll discuss this again. But yeah, I don't know. Like, I think there's a trade-off here by saying, like, okay, given that we have to do hypothetical parties if we want to study the Netherlands, yeah, we have to make some other choices. And we thought that then maybe voting for a hypothetical party might not be so informative. But yeah, also please, say if you think otherwise.
Yeah, I'm just going to jump in quickly as well. I mean, I think this is exactly a great question. This is what we've been discussing a lot. And one thing that we were worried about is also pre-treatment, right? So certain parties have been kind of um, been more in coalition negotiations. So that's kind of could be a quite challenging way to study this if you have certain parties that, for instance, were dropped out of coalition negotiations because they had a particular position in these negotiations. And that's difficult, right? Because how can we really cleanly assess whether it's a kind of a general principle that people don't like compromise versus keeping your ground? And so I'm thinking, for instance, about the GroenLinks example. So it's quite probable that this experience creates a kind of a quite idiosyncratic response from their voters, and that will be very different for a VVD voter, for instance.
I wonder whether the design actually safeguards against this pre-treatment effect. I mean, if they have that memory, then even if you use the abstract example, they might still evoke that memory. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think that's a problem for then all experimental studies on any public opinion.
Yeah. No, I
You
don't.
know, when you were my supervisor, you could ask me to solve like the world, but now I can.
Okay, we have a lot of other questions. Let's turn to those. Dirk de Cleer, question about the different forms of compromise. I can see how at least two parties make concessions in the tit for tat and meeting in the middle form. But how does that work for capitulation? Can capitulation also be seen as a concept distinct from compromise?
I would say capitulation is a form of compromise. If you accept that compromise is giving up something for getting back, what you give up in capitulation is your position on issues. What you get back is the position in government, meaning that you can, you know, for some parties that has intrinsic values, and otherwise it has at least value that you can design policies later on that might not have been in the coalition agreement. So it's a part, like, I think it's just a form of compromise. So it's not distinct, like none of them are different from compromise. They're just different ideas of how to compromise. But thanks, Dirk.
Okay, next question, Isabella Rebasso. Two questions. Thanks a lot, Mariken and Maurits. Really great to hear more about this project. First point refers to capitulation. Could this be made more appealing if it is a potential junior partner that can only enter the coalition by capitulating? The Green Party question. Moreover, isn't a risk of capitulation, leaving it out of the coalition agreement, that there is still some hope to push through the agenda in government?
Maurits, you can go.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a good question. I mean, what we really want to get at there is that you don't get the kind of the. Why do you want to go in government? You want to go in government because you can fight for your issues and actually implement policies about them, and that's what you kind of forsake here. So I think, of course, it's possible that people think, well, down the road it might still be possible through a different way, but I think what matters here also is that we kind of assess this difference between capitulation versus the other effects, right? So we expect that capitulation is a less attractive compromise than these other two, and I think that's key for our test. Mariken, do you agree?
Yeah, and I also think, let me think. So capitulation is not leaving it out of the coalition agreement. It's just saying, I'm giving in all of my stuff here, and the other option is the no compromise. Is just leaving it out. And like, I don't know, Isabella, we've talked about this before, and you know how much I struggle with like having this unequal treatment. So maybe I'll just, you know, contact you a little bit more about this to think more of whether this actually would make it a more equal treatment. But I also do agree with Maurits. So yeah, I'm in the middle.
Okay, second question from Isabella. In study 4, do you expect that things like principle tenacity, absolutism, or mistrust can be experimentally manipulated? I could imagine that they are quite stable and robust to manipulation, or are they rather moderators of treatment effects on trust in the party?
Yeah, thanks, Isabella. That's exactly what we struggle with. This I think refers back to whether you believe that people can, at certain points can be more principled or not, or whether they always have the same levels of I don't know, being principled. As the same for mistrust. Now, do you have sometimes more or less mistrust in other people, or do you have a stable characteristic? I actually don't know. I don't know a lot of studies that show that like either the one or the other is true. So I think for now we decided to actually be an outcome variable, to kind of like to be manipulated by the treatment. If it doesn't work, we can always, say that later in another experiment we try the other way around. But I think it's difficult for me still to think about if we want to test the mechanism, you want that to be activated so that it should be an outcome variable. But I could also see it is a moderator of something. So here we're still, this is why we didn't pre-register it yet, because we go up and down. Well, even in every conversation I have with Maurits, at least 5 times. So yeah, I don't think I cannot give you a clear answer.
Yeah, I think this relates to this kind of broader discussion whether these things are kind of stable traits or whether they're a state you are in, and we are aiming for the latter, right? And the question is, and that's the question we're asking ourselves, is this the right way to measure or assess these kind of states you're in, feeling distrust against other people, as opposed to kind of a general trait you always have. So, but I think in general, these studies in the past have shown that questions that tend to measure traits are answered very differently if they follow a certain vignette or experiment. So I think they can be experimentally manipulated, and I think that's what we're hoping to achieve. But you're exactly right that in a different version of this experiment, we actually had them as moderators, measured as as variables pre-treatment.
Okay, next question from Sanne van Oosten. Hi, Mariken and Maurits. I like your ideas and congrats on your Veni, Mariken. And Maurits, I guess. I really understand why you got a Veni with this topic and perspective. Regarding experiment 2 on the types of compromise, I can imagine reactions to compromise not only depend on the type of compromise, but also on the type of issue. I believe I saw you plan to use the issue of minimum wage. Wouldn't people react differently if confronted with a social-cultural issue? Is this something you could add into your design? Well, with plenty of money, yes, of course. But
actually, for the second study, we do aim to do minimum wage and CO2 tax, which is a cultural issue. But also, it's a 2x2x2. I think the first time I spoke about it, it was a 25 by 35 by 112 study. So we're really, really proud to have it made to a 2x2x2. We're not, at this point in time, at least, not very keen on adding another dimension. But maybe later on, we're both interested in this topic. So it might be that that a social cultural issue would work differently. At the same time, actually the work by Tim Ryan would say that if you feel very strongly about something, it doesn't really matter if that's cultural, economically, because you feel just very strongly about that issue. And yeah, we just pick one that is relatively easy to grasp at that point in time.
Yeah, so well, I mean, I think it's a good question. What is interesting is that previous research shows that people can feel really strongly about very different issues. So not all the issues that we think are moral issues like abortion, but also some people feel really, really principled about bailing out banks or things like that, right? So, and how, depending on how you feel about these issues, your willingness to compromise on these issues would differ. And I think that's not what we want to do in this study, but I think it's definitely on the list.
thanks. Then Matthijs Roduin. Cool project, Mariken and Maurits. I was wondering, why not include another observational study between studies 1 and 2? Why not examine existing cross-national overtime surveys, including political trust and related variables, that tap into compromise attitudes and link this to vote choice. You could then connect this again to information about the party someone voted for. Did this party participate in a coalition? And what kind of coalition was this? Did the party have to compromise a lot? What in turn does this mean for political trusts? Of course, this information would be very rough, but it might form a good stepping stone to the experiments.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I mean, I think we've been thinking about different types of designs. I mean, I think now we have 4 studies in the paper. So, and of course, it's a general trend that our papers are denser and we have more studies, but perhaps a 5th study is too ambitious. But yeah, I mean, I think we've been thinking about these, and I think this is a very, very nice idea in terms of cross-sectional variation and also over time. Another possibility would be to look at panel data and to see, for instance, I think the 2012 Dutch election is very interesting, where you had 2 parties that were their polar opposites in the campaign and then worked together, and that's very interesting. So the Social Democrats and the conservative liberals. So that's also an interesting point where to see what is the effect of compromise in coalition on party sympathy in that respect. So I think it will be great. I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe it's too much. I'm not sure what Mariken thinks.
I don't know. I don't know what I think. I think it is, but I don't like. Yeah, I just don't know. In a way, I think it's good. On the other hand, there are so few questions on compromise, and even the indirect ones that we have to construct them, which that's not going to be the issue. But yeah, I don't know whether this would add something to our idea that compromise comes with reputational costs, and showing this now cross-nationally, and then also over time. There are so many other things that we also have to consider, given that we act like, I at least have this idea, not tested yet, but that people become more unwilling to compromise. And that's also been theorized by some of the people, that given that the type of, we live in a more quote unquote permanent campaigning period where, politicians are confronted all the time with polls and are kind of held against some measure, that compromising becomes more politicized. I don't know what, if I find that this is the case since, whatever, and not in the 90s, I'm not quite sure if that really helps us with the experimental design. And I do think it helps us a lot with explaining much more things, that maybe this would be actually for another paper.
Yeah, one thing perhaps it's also important to mention is that questions on compromise are very rare, right? So in the US, they've been in a couple of surveys, but we've been able to use the CSCS data here. And that's also because actually they tried to include the populist attitude scales, and then kind of botched it by not including all the items that were in the original scale. But still, they have this question, and this question is the question asked by Hibbing and Thies Moore in their Stealth Democracy book. So this compromise is selling out on your principles. So there are not so many opportunities to look at this at actual compromise attitudes over time. But of course, it would be interesting to connect it to some kind of party behavior data. That will be definitely a very interesting study.
Bert.
Yeah, thanks. Really ambitious and great project. My first question relates a little bit back to what Gijs was asking. I was a bit surprised that compromise was used here first as an independent variable, and then so why not use these data sets to first explain who is accepting of compromise? Because now you're controlling for a whole bunch of things, keeping constant, and then you find a correlation with trust. So my first question, would it not be also, if you have ambitious to figure out who is susceptible, sure, absolutism is not in there, but you can get some proxies for dogmatism or sort of like ideological extremity. So I think that's one thing. And then the second question I have related to that study is, to me, it seems I'm not convinced that trust is the reputational cost you're getting at. And also, I'm not, I think Matthijs' suggestion, for instance, of looking at actual behavior is more appealing. But so my question is trust really the theoretical construct you're interested in? So these are the first two questions. See if other people have comments or something.
Yeah, I think I mean, it's an interesting idea, who's accepting compromise. That I think that's something we should definitely explore.
I actually think we have that on the list to explore.
Yeah, I mean, but you're right that this has to do with our dependent variable. So as we do it now, and that's also why we've set up the first study as we have, is because we're looking at the effect of compromise on trust. And in the first study, it's kind of a general trust in politicians, and in the second and the subsequent studies, it's about the party in question. I mean, I think what actually both of us had independently in our Vini applications, or in our proposals, was this idea of credibility. So are the parties making credible? Are they credible in their behavior? Are they sincere? And I think that was the kind of the aim, and we subsequently operationalized that as political trust. Another alternative dependent variable we considered was, is this party doing a good job representing its voters, which is a more specific way of asking that. But then we would kind of, I think what we now did, and maybe that's not the right strategy, but we should have a kind of streamlined design looking at the effect of compromise on trust, is to keep kind of those independent variables stable across all studies, right? Because we cannot measure credibility in a perfect way in the observational study. We stuck with trust, and that's why we operationalize credibility as trust also in the experiments.
Bert, before you go, can I ask you a question? Do you not see any? You don't think that having people voting for party A or B is a risk?
Yeah, could I quickly pick back on what Maurits said? Maurits, one way to maybe make this more credible is to do some sort of placebo testing there. You figure out what are things that compromise has no effect on. Yeah. In order to, which is not sort of trust and related to it, but what are things in the survey that you could say, well, there it should not, maybe you could think of some things, and maybe there's a cluster of dependent variables where it has an association with, and a cluster of aspects where it hasn't. I don't know, like cynicism is probably in all these surveys. Is that related to cynicism or not? Or, you guys think more about this, but yeah. And then related to the party A and B, I do share some of Gijs's concern of making this so stylized that I wonder a little bit if the amount of making this experiment about A and B, and then 100% of your compromises are 100% of your principles, 75-50, that's so far detached from how also for instance, in media, there's been a discussion about compromises. This is often about key issues. Are the Greens selling out on the green issue, or is D66 selling out on education? So is this, I think you've designed clever experiments, but are they now so they're internally valid, but do they speak to the concept you're trying to study? That I'm not 100% sure of. And so especially then in terms of a dependent variable, that is then like the what do you feel towards party A or B, that I'm not sure if that's capturing then the concept that you want to study in.
So I'm fully with you that like this kind of 50% of the proposals is, let's say, somewhat, like, let's use your word, stylized. At the same time, if we do not do that, you get very unequal treatment. Because some things are just more appealing. If we say on this issue, we meet in the middle, it's about one issue. And then the other issue, I gained something that wasn't there to begin with. And that other thing, I thought things get unbalanced. So treatments become, I don't know, stronger or weaker. And that is, I thought that that would be another problem. I'm not sure whether that's a worse problem, I thought so, at least, or we thought so when we talked to Maurits and I about this. We thought it should be like that. At least the expected utility of something should be relatively similar.
Yeah, maybe I can jump in here. So when you kind of started your talk, I was thinking that this is mostly about framing the same outcome differently, right?
My 2 years in communication science have learned me that anything you can talk about in this way. Yes.
Yeah, but I would find such an approach to have a bit more ecological validity than this approach, because in the newspaper you would never read something like, "Oh, the price is 0%, 0 versus 100%." It's more about either using the language of compromise, if you want to phrase it positively, or the language of capitulation, if you want to phrase it negatively. But yeah, maybe. So I'm wondering why are you? But maybe there's something in the theory that is really important to you, that you're really going for these numerical.
No, it just was my only way to think about, like thinking about like that things are actually the same. So I thought about this kind of equivalence framing at this point in time, and we can also make it more what you say is emphasis framing, not saying like certain things highlight and other things don't highlight. Yeah, but still, then the question is, will treatments not be incredibly unbalanced?
Well, yeah, I mean, at a minimum, you could use a pre-treatment for that, but sorry, a pre-test.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I'm not sure if I get this answer, because I mean, unbalanced, or do they actually have different effects?
If certain things are more appealing because, I don't know, like you get something in return that you care much more about, or yeah, so that's how we thought. If like the last option, the tit for tat, 2 issues are involved. In the other 2 type of compromises, they're not necessarily 2 issues, can be on 1 issue even. But for the tit for tat, you need to have 2 issues. And we thought that would make, I know, then you get so much clearer, you get something and give something back. Yeah, we were thinking, or at least this is how I thought about it. This is, I don't know, it felt like a kind of like an economical game almost, like one of these.
Do you not need to take one step back, Mariken, because you want to make distinctions already in the compromises? And should you not first look at just compromise in general, sort of like the extent to which an issue you care about is like the party gets that issue or not?
So that's not the first what we want to do in the second experiment, no?
Yeah, but isn't that the first, rather than making it more complex, is that not the first thing to establish in a series of experiments?
Yeah.
And then, so maybe one design I was thinking about, but maybe it makes no sense. It's being recorded, so let's see. But you could ask in a 2-way study, you could first ask people about the party they support and what's the most important issue they think for this party to achieve.
Yeah.
Let's say the Greens and the environment. And then in the second experiment, you start randomly, you start actually tailoring these treatments randomly to that the Greens have succeeded in getting the environment as an important issue, or they've given it away.
Yeah.
And how people then evaluate the credibility. And you can do this for every party. So you can then say, hey, there's a situation. You can maybe even make it more, move away from the national government to say there's been special to a green agenda, or the D66 investment in education. PVV, get rid of some migrants out of the local election. That's harder, but something along these lines. But you can tailor it almost in that way. You can make it for every individual based on his or her party preferences, whether or not that there's been a compromise on that key issue, and see what that does to the credibility.
Yeah. So that is exactly what we aim to in a more hypothetical way, experiment B, which would be field B, and then experiment 3 and 4 we would have weighed with that anyway.
But I think there's something to consider if to bring in the actual parties, and but then I would do a 2-way experiment where you invite people first, because otherwise you have some priming effects. Because if you start to think, hey, what's an important issue? Well, guess what? They gave it away. I'm not sure if you can do that within the same survey experiment or safe survey experiment in a couple minutes, but that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another way to actually think about it. Thanks, Bert. This is definitely one of the options we did not consider.
Well, I think, I mean, we did consider it in a way, right? Because here it's just also what the question previously was about, don't we want to consider more issues? And and basically the challenge, I think it's always the challenge when designing an experiment, how close, how externally valid does it have to be? How close do you stay to the kind of the kind of the dry mechanism behind it? And now I think we're very much geared towards the latter. And of course, if you include more political, if it's more about parties, that's an interesting choice. Maybe we're doing too many things at the same time. I think that's also something we've been kind of discussing a little bit. Doing sticking to your position or compromise, as well as mechanisms, as well as types of compromise. At the same time, I think they all speak to the same issue, so and to the same bottom line question. So I think that's for us to kind of disentangle in the next few weeks.
Okay, I think that with that, that might be a good roundup, Maurits, that we have. That I think we've gotten a really interesting and good discussion on both substance and design. I am very curious where you will bring this. You might be together doing a VD project already, or writing a book on this topic. But at least it's a lot of exciting and good work, and I hope that we can see some of this at some point again here in the lab. I'm gonna use the last few minutes to, first of all, thank you for this presentation. I think, Mariken, you have moved the standards for the way we should visually do this, in sort of sitting in the screen. That looks really nice. I hadn't seen that before, but it's great. And I also want to and use this to have a couple of announcements. So next week, we have Patrick Stewart, who has also been able, after a few weeks of Zoom banning by unknown people, not by us, Patrick, but by Zoom, was able to join us today. He will present next week on, obviously, facial displays of political leaders. The week after, we have graduates, students who present, Micah Holman and John Sengis from Temple University. And then we have almost finalized the speaker series up till June, I think. We're waiting for the last people to confirm, but it includes speakers like Jif Leukes on January 8th, Ursula Dexeker from the University of Amsterdam. We have Leroy Smeergot from University of Cambridge, Lou Safra from Sciences Po, Teresa Kuhn. There's going to be a whole bunch of really exciting speakers that we have from various different fields. So I'm excited about that. It will be online hopefully by next week. And in the meantime, I wish those of you in the Netherlands a pleasant Sinterklaas weekend. Be nice to Sinterklaas, and we'll see each other next week, hopefully. Okay, thank you.